You're listening to Sunday Opinion. Today's studio guest could be seen at this year's Tynwald wearing a Maori cloak. She was given this as a sign of the respect with which she's held in the Maori community. And her title, The Lady from Flanders Fields, was given to her in Leven, New Zealand for her research on New Zealand soldiers who were in the Battle of Flanders Fields, a hamlet in Belgium near the border with France, located in Flanders Fields, where she is from. Well, she's with me today to discuss her past and present work and to explore her statement that her aim is to assist First World War soldiers from the Isle of Man to live again. Well, Dominique, thank you for joining us on Sunday Opinion today.
Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon.
And to you. Now, what brought you to the Isle of Man?
Well, the mission, as you stated it, I think you put it very well. I've been on a mission for about 15 years now, and I'm trying to bring these men alive. Mm-hmm. These men who were lost in Flanders Fields, where I'm coming from.
Right.
But were from New Zealand, or at least enlisted in New Zealand, and one amongst them is a Manxman called Robert Boyd.
Mm-hmm. So obviously he went out to New Zealand to live there. When you say enlisted, they signed up or they were simply conscripted?
No, he was a volunteer.
Right.
He left the Isle of Man to work in England and worked for a firm called Debenham. Mm-hmm. And so that's why he went up to New Zealand. So he represented the firm he was working for, and then he enlisted as a volunteer.
And his family obviously still back here in the Isle of Man then in that period of time.
At the time when he left the island, his father had died. His father's name was Robert as well, and he was part of the constabulary, as later on was his brother John. Mm-hmm. And after he enlisted, he came towards this side of the world from New Zealand, and he visited his mother, and while he was visiting his mother, she died. Quite sudden, and that was in February 1917, and the poor man was killed in action on the 2nd of August, not long after.
It sounds interesting that there was one Manxman. Now, New Zealanders, we think of New Zealanders perhaps as very similar people to British people, but as far as I can see from looking at some of the tales here that you have, quite a lot of them were Maoris.
They were. Well, most people know that Maori people are considered as being the indigenous people of New Zealand.
Yes.
And of course there are many tribes, what you would call here as a clan, or consider as a clan, or in Scotland as well. So yes, you do have many tribes. In the beginning they were not allowed to go. And actually they were not even allowed to fight until they were in Gallipoli, and they didn't have enough men to fight because there were so many losses.
Well, I've looked somewhere else and I see a note that says that the British government, it just shows you how times change, British government didn't want the Maoris to fight against the white race. Is that right?
Absolutely right. Yeah. They were, as a matter of fact, what happened is that they were frightened that they would learn too many skills and use them afterwards. But everything changed when other coloured tribes from other countries participated and were allowed. So there was no reason for the government to say no.
Well, let's go back. Sorry, yes. Sorry, I interrupted you then. You going to say?
No, and I was going to say they were quite keen. Maori people were quite keen because they wanted to show they were part, they wanted to be equal or treated as equal to the white people or the English mainly. And so they were quite keen to participate and show their loyalty to the king, the then king.
Just that loyalty didn't really carry on forever, did it? Because now the Maoris still have an independence campaign running today.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do.
Now, you got this title, Lady from Flanders Fields. Now, is that to do with your research, or is that because where you're from?
It's both. It's both. And, even the word lady, I'm not always used to be called a lady, it's a compliment as such, isn't it? But being the lady from Flanders Fields, it comes because when people ask me, where are you from? I usually do not say Belgium because that wouldn't ring a bell. not in New Zealand. I mean, here, in the Isle of Man, people would know that Brussels is the capital of Belgium, and because of the European institutions being there. But in New Zealand, they are more familiar with Flanders Fields because of the poem in Flanders Fields, where the poppies grow and where the graves are row on row.
Yes, yes.
So actually Flanders, there are 4 Flanders. There is one Flanders part. It used to be one, long time ago. It used to be one all together. But now part of it is in Holland, in the Netherlands. Then you have Flanders, East and West in Belgium. And I'm from East Flanders. And then you have French Flanders, which is in France, in the north of France. So all of these people living all in these various Flanders are people from Flanders Fields. But I am too.
Right. Now, but do they all speak the same language? Because there's sort of 3 languages there, isn't it?
Well, 2 languages, I would say.
Yeah.
So
not French.
Well, French, the south part of Belgium is the French-speaking part, and that is where my mother is from. So my mother's tongue is French, but I was born in the Flemish part because my father is from the Flemish part, and so I can talk to the people talking Dutch or Flemish. It's very similar. And I can talk in the Netherlands, and then I can talk French to the people living in Flanders, in France, in the north of France, because that's French.
You do very well in English as well, I might add.
Thank you.
Now, this whole area that we're talking about was what used to be called, for various history reasons and in books, the Western Front, isn't it? That's
exactly.
Really what it is. Well, there's so many trench accounts from that part of the world, but your book seems to feature a village which doesn't seem to crop up much in the historic records of any of the countries.
It's quite interesting that you would use the word village, because I didn't. I used the word hamlet.
Right.
Because, as I see it, it was not even a village, you see. It was part of a town. But it was like the industrial area of that town. Very small, and it had lots of factories. And one of them was a sugar refinery, and it had been taken by the Germans in 1914. And it was still held by them in 1917. And then for some reason, which are not entirely clear until today to me, it was decided by the British, head of the army, that that place called La Basseville should be taken. And only the New Zealand division was sent over there. So it's quite it's a bit of a complicated situation in the sense that they were not part of the Passchendaele battle, as it is known. But I don't know if you're aware, and some people might, that they're always talking about the Ypres salient. So at the right end, down end of that Ypres salient, that's where La Basseville is. And it is even left out of the maps, and interesting enough. So it was entirely forgotten.
So how many New Zealand soldiers died there?
I've made a list. It was never, and there was never a list made. But I've made a list, and I've come up to 1,010. 1,000 at the time of the publishing of the book. And I found another 10 cents. So that's quite a bit, because bear in mind that in New Zealand, they had 1 million inhabitants. So if you lose in a very short period of time, if you lose 1,010, that's a huge amount. So I still don't understand exactly why that part was forgotten by the British and the New Zealanders and everyone. Well, it seems except me. But that was that one voice from one particular soldier that didn't want this to happen. So that's why I was given it the title, The Voices from Flanders Fields. So that one particular voice was a Maori voice.
Where did you find that?
And that was on the east coast of the North Island, in a little place called Porangahau, in the middle of nowhere. And I met the family of that soldier, and they told me, he was killed, our forebear was killed in France. We don't know where. We don't know anything about it. But, they told me, his nephew, the first one born after his death, was given the name of the battle. And I said, what was his name then? And they said, Le Bessy. Now, Le Bessy didn't ring a bell to me. But I felt it was important to them. And also, I felt very, very strongly for this boy. You know, I call him a boy, even if he was 25 when he died. But I felt for his mother, because she would have lost, as a Maori woman, she would have lost her boy on the other side of the world, and knowing that never, ever she would be able to go and visit his grave, if he had a grave. Actually, he doesn't.
Boy, what happened to most of those? Are you saying there were many without graves? We see these very splendid war graves around the place, and you say they're not in those.
No, lots of them are not. Because don't forget that, you know, all during the rest of the war, there were heavy bombardments, and even more and more. Because the First World War was the first war where planes were used. As part of, you know, it's the same as tanks and the first time. So it was an entirely different war than the wars that had been going on before. So all these, even when people were buried, all these graves are just bombarded and everything is gone again into many pieces. So a lot of these men are still part of the soil.
But their records still exist, do they?
Of course, and the families haven't forgotten, but they don't know where to go. If they want, you know, nowadays people are traveling much more. If they want to go, or even the great nephews, and lots of people are traveling now, young people and even older people, you know, lots of people are traveling. They don't know where to go. So I thought that was really important. It was really important to do something about that. So I really made it my mission to find out where the location was. But even local people didn't know. So I ended up knocking at doors of all people, saying, would you know where La Basseville, when I found out it was La Basseville and not Le Bessy, I asked them, would you know where it is located? And then they said, well, my parents were born here. I was born here just after the war. And so... And I was asking who else would know. So I was, you know, looking into and talking to other people. And that's how I came to the information that I have, which is unique. No one had done it before, strangely enough. So it took the lady from Flanders Fields to find out about this forgotten battle where only New Zealanders were involved in Belgium and not in France, as all the records were mentioning.
It does seem to raise a fairly significant question as to why, with all the other records that there is of the First World War, this particular campaign, battle, whatever you want to call it, was almost officially erased from the records.
I would say that perhaps, I'm very careful now, I'm not a military historian myself. As you mentioned, I was a judge, so I did this book as a judge would do, you know, looking at all the sides. But I'm not a military historian, but I would say they have a very good reason. I think it was a decoy. So in other words, they were not trying to gain land. They were only trying to distract the Germans. And actually there were many more German soldiers there, billeted there and staying there than they anticipated. So, if they were keeping them busy, the colonials, you know, they were just ex-colonials, the New Zealanders would keep them busy, and then they could fight up more north towards Passchendaele. That's what happened.
But it comes over almost as if they said, to use your word, the colonials is dispensable.
That's how it feels. When I'm reading everything I've been reading and talking to all the people I've been, that's the impression I'm getting, yes.
Well, of course, in Britain, they used to take a whole towns full of young men at the one go, and if they were in one of these battles, that all the young of the town would be wiped out at one go as well. My wife comes from an area in Lancashire where they still commemorate the Accrington Pals, which exactly that happened. But when you read some of the records, the UK government's records, as you went further north out of London, they seem to consider these areas more and more dispensable. was quite
Absolutely.
remarkable. Now, the area now, of course, it took an enormous battering during the Second World War. That this town, or hamlet as you call it, it's gone. There's nothing there now, is there?
No, and unfortunately, even the name was gone, you see. So that was part of my problem. So what happened is that I got in touch with the local government and I advocated the idea of putting something back there so that families could come up around in the place, when they are visiting all the other battlefields, and would be able to know where their forebears were killed. So since 31st of July last year, 2017, we've had an official with the New Zealand, with a representative of the New Zealand embassy as well, and the local government. We had an unveiling of a plaque, and we had a really moving ceremony where all the names were read out aloud, 1010. And we unveiled a plaque with a map so that people know where to go and understand what happened and understand what it was like 100 years ago and how it is now, because it doesn't look at all like it was. Instead of sugar refinery, it's a factory where they make frites, chips. So that's entirely different.
But you have said in one of your papers that I've read that the war's significant impact on Belgium at that time, we're talking about the First World War, not the Second one, is still felt today.
It is, because one of the things that I discovered fully, or I discovered for myself, very interestingly, is how it affects people, the next generations. So to talk about my own family, as an example, my mother's father, I discovered, was a spy for the British and the French. Now, this was like a story, the stories that goes in families. And I wanted to find out if there was any truth to the story. And actually, there absolutely was, because he's mentioned in the lists in Kew, in the archives in Kew, he's mentioned in the list as an agent, he and his brother. Then I discovered that my father's cousin, she was also a spy. So that's quite interesting. That's on the other side. At the same time, my grandfather, my father's father, and his father, both as civilians, were taken as hostages in the place where they lived. Why? Because my great-grandfather was a politician. So at that time, he probably was considered as the most important man in that town. And my grandfather, his son, was almost a lawyer. He had just one exam to pass and then he became a lawyer. So he was staying with him, and the rest of the family had gone away, because Belgium was invaded, and that's how it all started. I don't know if people are really fully aware of that, but it's the British helped the poor little Belgium, because Belgium was invaded in August 14, and the British had promised the Belgian people that they would preserve them from any war, because Belgium was a buffer.
And it's small too, of course. But,
yes.
But that is one of the reasons given. But the First World War, as such, was bubbling for a long time before that, of course, wasn't it? It was.
But
just
that's bubbling. But I mean, the real start was in August. So the English, the British, they came to the rescue. But in the very beginning of the war, many old medieval towns, and one of them was the one where my grandfather, my great-grandfather, well, my family lived. These places were voluntarily, the fire was lit.
Right. Well, you're talking about that, and you're talking about the various people. Now, it must be obviously it's impossible, isn't it, to find now people who were alive at that particular period of time. But do their descendants, when you actually contact them and find them, do they still have a collective family memory that's fairly active?
They absolutely do, and they are very, very, most of the time, they are very grateful that I'm bringing information that they would never be able to get because they don't know the language, the local language. They don't realize it's Belgium because all the war records and all the paperwork mentions France.
Mm-hmm. My grandfather served in the First World War, and he served in what was loosely called the trenches. And one of his jobs was to take ammunition to the front in what was effectively a horse-drawn cart, like something out of the American Wild West, which was a highly risky business, I gather, in this case. But he survived, and he came home. And I can recall very clearly, as you do with a young boy, saying to him, "Tell us a bit about the war, Grandad. What did you do? Tell us about the usual questions you might expect a young fella to ask." And I can still see my grandfather today looking straight at me and saying, "You don't want to know." And he'd never tell me. He shut it out. So there does seem to be a great deal of information that was never released because the individual didn't want to talk about it.
I probably, Richard, it was too painful to talk about. You know, what I've been told by families is that these men had nightmares, later in life in particular, and they lost, of course, all their pals. And thinking about these things would bring up very, very painful memories. But it's like what I was saying earlier. You know, my grandfather and my great-grandfather having been hostages. They came back in about a year later because the Red Cross, the American Red Cross, intervened. They came back, but for the rest of their lives, they were tainted by what they had been through. And yes, damaged, definitely. And then, of course, Belgium, like my grandfather, in Belgium, we had the Second World War and invaded again. And they went through it all again. And I can see my father is still alive. My father is turning 90 this year. And, you know, for him, the First and the Second World War, because they lost so much. And the same for my mother. You know, they lost everything. In a material way. They lost everything. So they were extremely affected, not only by the losses of their friends, but also by the losses of their homes and all the things they had, you know, that was important to them, you know, photos or whatever. So it's terrible. And I can see how it has made my father who he is.
In what sense? You mean resilient or
no,
understanding?
Not necessarily positive. You know, very bitter as well.
Yes.
And I've heard the same thing by other people. Or one of the things that I was told quite often is that these men who came back and never told about what exactly they had been through, except for funny stories, they were unpredictable. What I mean, you know, the way they explained to me, the sons or the nieces or the nephews, they said all of a sudden they could, you know, something was happening and they became very sort of strange. So you would say perhaps a shell shock with effects so many years later when something was triggering what had happened. So mentally they were very much affected, and you pass that on. It's called transgenerational trauma.
My grandfather clearly had something the matter with him when he came back. Apart from the fact he wouldn't tell me about it, I can think through the sort of things that happened within the family. One of the things he did was he became a little too fond of the beer, you know, things like that. But yes, he did, and he shut everything out. But he did a remarkably good job of putting it in a box and shutting it off. So, but I feel there must have been many people like that who, from both wars, really, when you think about it. As going back to the area that you're in, that you live in now, the Flanders area, it is known, especially during wartime, for its poppies. Are they still there? Are the poppy fields still there?
In huge numbers, and everywhere. Actually, the poppies grow where the soil has been turned on. So it means you see them in any kind of places, even around buildings that are put up, new buildings, and the site has not been worked on for a while, but has been. All of a sudden, poppies just, come up.
They're all the red ones, are they?
Yes.
Well, we can talk a lot more about this. Let me ask you first of all, if I may, because we have another programme that follows this at 1:15. The Mannin line, which that's part of our afternoon's proceedings, where those listening to us can join us as well. So would you like to roll on to that and see if we get a few phone calls and texts and emails?
It would be great, first, if I could find some family members of this Robert Boyd. That was a Manxman.
We'll talk about that then, shall we?
Yes, and perhaps already now mentioning the name of his brothers, William and John Boyd. And the other thing, I'm looking for some sponsors as well.
Right, well, we go back to that, but we have plenty of time at 1:15 after the news, weather and sport, because there we end this week's Sunday Opinion, in which we met Dominique Cooreman to discuss her book about soldiers from New Zealand who fought in Belgium during the First World War and her plans for research in the Isle of Man. Well, we didn't get too much of that, so we'll deal with that when we come to the Mannin line. And there we are. Welcome back to the Mannin line now. Now, as I said before, I'm Roger Watterson, and on the telephone switch is William King. Now, he's there finger poised to answer the calls as they come in, and we would like to have someone to answer, please. So the number is 66 13 68. You can also text me straight to the studio here to 166177, or you can email to studio@manxradio.com. One of our regular correspondents every Sunday is Peter Kelly. Now, normally he's done it again, he's to tell us that he was up at the Grand Union Camera Obscura just outside here this morning, setting up the lenses for the two lady volunteers who are on duty today, and they're from the Isle of Man Victorian Society. And he says the pictures are good and it's well worth seeing. And the volunteers this afternoon to greet the public are Chris and Amber. So there's no more garden parties for us to dash around today. You did right, Peter, there is not. So there we are, that's the camera obscure. But he also goes on to say, which is, he's obviously been listening, he says post-Tynwald makes a change from post-Brexit. Saw the fur cloak at Tynwald, and I thought it was Alana Griffiths, one-time councillor, come back again to visit us. This cloak, this Maori cloak, how do you pronounce that, Dominique?
Well, Roger, it's called a kākahu. So, as you can hear, the E is a long one, the first one, kākahu, but commonly it's known as korowai.
Right.
So it's a symbol in the Maori world of the high regard people enjoy who are wearing it. So I was presented with a Maori cloak because of the work I've been doing. Not only, and they consider not only for the Maori families, because I'm sure you're aware that there are no true Maoris, pure Maoris anymore, because they are all mixed up with people from other origins and ethnicities. But the Maori people are very keen on knowing where they are coming from, and they call it whakapapa, genealogy. That's how they call it. So the cloak is very significant. It's the chiefs who were wearing it, or people who had done special things. So, yes, and it's quite visible.
It's an award, a bit like we have awards here for people who do something special. Yes.
Yes, well, also, I would say, and it
keeps
you warm. It keeps you warm.
Okay, I was going to say ours tend to be a medal, but this is a little more flamboyant.
Well, yes, in a way, I'm sure, yes, you could consider it that way.
Yes. Did you expect it? I mean, was it just something that happened while you were there? Did they give you any warning?
Well, I was not that surprised because it happened towards the end of my stay after 15 years. So it's not that obvious. You don't get it straight away. You have to deserve it, and it's a sign of what they call mana in the Maori language. And mana stands for a lot of things, like prestige and authority and power and charisma and lots of other similar words. So if you have mana and you prove to have mana, then you deserve to wear the cloak. the kakaho.
To agree, it's a bit like Manx, isn't it? If you ask for a clear definition of Manx today, you struggle a bit with it because there's all sorts of people from all sorts of places. But the one thing that is quite still strong here, very strong here, is the sense of Manx identity. Does that apply to the Maori still too?
Absolutely, because through their whakapapa, through their genealogy, they want to go back straight to some of the boats where they call it a waka, and they came out on 7, all of them, all the original ones. They say came from the Polynesia Islands and came on 7 canoes, 7 waka, and each of them was a main tribe. And then they had sub-tribes called hapu, but everyone relates to one or several tribes, and going back until 1200 or even earlier.
Well, you seem to have quite a skill at languages. Did you have to get your mind around any of theirs?
I did, but I also went to classes. I wanted to, a language is very interesting, a different language than the one you were brought up with. It's very interesting because it also involves a culture. So by learning the language, you learn a lot about the people. And as they say, there is a Maori saying, what is the most important thing in the world? It is tangata e tangata e tangata, which means the people, the people, the people. Right. So language is a way to get to the people.
I'm interesting, if not surprised, to see then how it has survived so well, because English colonial history did a great deal to wipe out these cultures. Not the individuals maybe, but the cultures that supported them.
Well, they tried very hard, but then there was what they call a renaissance in the 70s, and they started to have kindergarten in Maori language. Right. So mothers were organizing that and making sure the children learned the Maori language. So there has been a revival of the language, which is a very good thing. And now it is even the second official language in New Zealand.
Was it a revival not just in the language but in the written word as well?
Well, originally they didn't have any written language. So it was the missionaries. Actually, it was a man called Williams, the Reverend Williams, who translated the Bible in Maori. And so they learned, English or British or Scottish, learned Maori that way, but also the other way around. So it was used to learn the English. So through the missionaries. Mm-hmm. And that's how the written language started. And now they have a written language as well. But it's more oral history than written history that they have. So what I'm doing, it's on purpose. What I've been doing with the book, it's on purpose because they want to have some records. They want to be able, when you have oral history, you have to be very careful about passing it on in a correct way. So it's so easy to stretch the truth, isn't it? Some people say, yes. Don't spoil the truth, don't spoil the story by telling the truth. So it is good to have it in writing, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, even in English, straight in English.
There is a Celtic tradition, of course, of stories, Shanachie stories being passed on from one person to another. I've often wondered just how much embellishment they get as they go along, but even so, there's a history in all societies of the spoken word. But here we are now using the spoken word. We're not writing it, we're speaking it. This is broadcasting. Do they have their own radio and television stations?
Yes, they do. Since 2004, they have a television station which works really well. And since 1 year, they are using subtitles, which I found very interesting. In France and in the UK, you don't have subtitles when people are using a different language. They just translate it, at the same time. Mm. In Belgium, we don't have that. So we have subtitles. And that's another way of learning the language. So now Maori television is, using subtitles when people speak Maori.
You've travelled to this place. This attracted your interest and your attention. There was a link between your originally homeland and the attention. But your original career as a lawyer must have been quite a bit removed from this.
Extremely. Not only as a barrister, but as a judge. Well, the good thing is that everything that I did before doing this research, starting this research, has been useful. I had to learn to interview a lot of people, make sure they were feeling at ease and telling me the truth.
Yes.
Isn't it? And only the truth, if possible. But it also, well, it was very useful, yes. And the other aspect is, and I use it in the book as well, which is all the sides. The truth, the perfect truth, of course, does not exist. We all know it's perception. But if you try to put on all the facts next to each other, you get some sort of truth altogether. So in the book, I even have a chapter by describing what happened to a German officer who was billeted in the same place that the New Zealand division had to take. And it was a diary that was given to me many years ago. And at first I didn't know what I was going to do with it until I realized that's another voice that needs to be heard, you see. So the title of the book, Voices, it's not by accident that I chose that word, because there are many ways of hearing the voices.
Well, that brings me to the question, because you are talking about a connection with voices. But are we talking just about literal voices? I mean, how do you connect to a voice of a man who's now dead 100 years?
Well, they have lots and lots of ways of doing it. They put up signs. First,
Who's they?
They are the soldiers.
Right.
They want to be heard. As I explained before.
But this is a spiritual thing now.
It is, absolutely.
Yeah.
I didn't, as a judge, of course, I couldn't think like that. But I've come to think like that because of the Maori people. Straight away, they said, "Who's this woman?" And then someone said, "Oh, she's the one who speaks to the dead." And at first it sounded a bit strange, but then gradually I came to understand. So what happens is, I've got all sorts of questions in my head. What was that? Where was that? Who? Why? And what happens is, all along, if I'm very observant, I can find keys or links to what I'm looking for. And that happened all the time. And some very, quite strange things happened. If you want, I can give you an example.
Oh, please do.
Okay. So this whole, as I said before, this whole book, the leader of the band, as it were, was a Maori man called Charles Rangiwawahia Shasha, because his father was Italian, his mother was Maori. And so he was the first. So the fact that I was touched in such a strong way, it's a spiritual connection. And that's what Maori believe as well. So his family said, it's very clear that he chose you, Dominique. I said, what do you mean chose me? Well, that man said, you have everything you need to do this kind of work. You have an intellectual capacity, you have the language, the knowledge, the background. You're doing everything that is needed to come to this result. And actually, they didn't have any information on him. And if you have a look in the book, there is a whole chapter on him. So what I did, I retraced all his steps. So I went to Egypt, where he went with the New Zealand division, because he was a main man. So he was one of the first contingent to leave New Zealand as the main body man. And so I went to Tasman. So I went to Hobart, because he stopped there. So I went there as well. So what I tried to do was get in touch with what is left of a spirit, because everywhere you go, you leave. We are all part of energy. We are made out of energy. So you leave a little bit of energy. It's like the fairies. I believe in the fairies. I do, up to a certain point. So to go back, so I went to Hobart, and then I went to Egypt and Cairo twice. I absolutely wanted to get into the military hospital where he had been. As a woman, it was not easy, but as you know, to prove that he really wanted me to go there, it came all along very easily. And in theory, a woman, not Muslim, not being from there at all, and being accepted and being able to talk in a military hospital and get some information, that's quite unusual. So all these things fall into place, as it were, and that is because he wanted me to find out things. So I went to Gallipoli as well, and then I met interesting people that I would never have met otherwise. So I started to become convinced during all these years that some other force is bringing me the information that I need. The only thing which is really important is that I have to be very observant. And I have to pay attention to detail. And I will find it. I can give you lots and lots of examples of things that happened.
So really, what you're saying is, apart from your academic research, there's a second force at play.
Absolutely.
And you think that it's guiding it. Now, when you go to these places, do you get a sensation? Is there something that happens? So what is the sensation? What does it do?
I'll give you the example because it was extremely, extremely strong. 2 examples. The first one is the monument where he doesn't have a grave, Charles, but his name is written on the Messines Ridge monument in Messines in Belgium. When I first saw it, without thinking, what I did was touching the place where his name was. And afterwards, Maori people said, that's exactly what we do. How did you know to do that? I said, I didn't. But and I felt very big emotion. The second time that was extremely strong was in Gallipoli. I arrived, he went to Chinook, he was in Chinook Bay. So his regiment, they left with 700 soldiers, and only 70 came out unscathed, and he was one of them. When I arrived there, so many of his mates would have been killed there. When I arrived there, the only thing that happened, and I couldn't control it, was crying. I cried and cried and cried and couldn't stop.
Well,
very strange.
Listening to what you're saying there, there's a Manx author who not long ago died, Nigel Neal, and he wrote a series of books, the Quatermass stories. He's better known for television series over here, but he wrote a series of them, including one where he was of the opinion that the human mind leaves imprint recordings into buildings. So it's not necessarily spiritual, but it's a technical thing. He thought, have you ever thought the possibility of that? You're actually picking up an imprint of something?
Yes. I'm not excluding that at all, because it happens so often, and it still happens. So like now, I'm looking for the family of Robert Boyd. I arrive in the island, and the first thing I see is a cenotaph in Douglas. I go to the cenotaph, and what do I see? His name. Mm-hmm. Then I go to Tynwald. I go to the plaque there. What do I see? His name. Then the next day, I go to the museum and do a little bit of research, and I find all sorts of information on him straight away. So it's another sign.
Now, Peter Kelly, who I mentioned before, has now sent another email in. Peter does a lot of this type of research, and Peter says, was he Robert Boyd, the Robert Boyd killed on the 2nd of August 1917? Exactly. The son of the late Inspector Boyd of Peel and Mrs. Boyd of 53 Derby Road, Douglas, aged 37.
Yes.
Right. If so, in looking for relatives, it's important to stress that it was a Boyd without an E, and as many families here are with one. And if it's he worked at Looney's before Debenhams in London and emigrated to New Zealand. So Peter, there we are. You see, there's another contact. He's picked it out from your conversation.
Absolutely. And what he is mentioning in his email is what I have found in the museum here in Douglas as well, in the Manx Museum, now, in the library.
interesting enough, Wilfred Tomlinson, who's one of our regulars, has come on to say, how is Maori television funded, is what he's...
by national government, they get money.
It's not
and they have very, very little firms or commercials, very, very little. Right. So it is really mainly funded by government, and it's good. It's really good television, and they bring out a lot of documentaries and a lot about the old stories and people's stories. Really interesting. I found it fascinating.
Well, Peter has I've just sent and Wilfred just sent me a link to the television station in New Zealand, which I looked at. I cannot pronounce the name. There's a name that runs right on the top of it. But yes, but they have quite a good on-demand service as well, by the look of it there. So
absolutely.
That's right. Right, now, it's time for us just to take a break at the moment. If those of you listening today, I know we've in an unusual subject, but if you'd like to join us in any way at all, the telephone number is 66 13 68. You can text to 166 177 or email to studio@manxradio.com.
Get the
Now, this is the last part of today's Mannin Line. With me in the studio is Dominique Cooreman, who has written a book, a very weighty tome here, Flanders Fields 1917, and New Zealand Voices from Flanders Fields. And we've been discussing some of this before, and we're also discussing this emphasis that she has on the word voices. And now you've, Dominique, you've talked about voices from the Isle of Man. Is this going to be a new project?
Oh, definitely it is, because I can see that people in the Isle, the Manx, are very interested in their families and where they come from and their history. As I could see at Tynwald, they like tradition. They are loyal people. Mm-hmm. That's how it feels to me. And sometimes it feels like I'm going a little back in time, which is nice. So they don't forget their past, which is really important. If you want to know what to do next, you need to know your past.
Well, the European Union, as it is now, with or without Britain, you're from Belgium, where, of course, the administrative centre and Strasbourg as well are connected. Has that made a great deal of difference to the way life is in Belgium today? Is this sort of community spirit, this sort of thing you were talking about before, has that been diluted?
Well, if you don't mind, I'd rather not go into politics.
Well, I'm just
this is a bit of politics. So we have a strong identity, feeling of identity, if that's what you're trying to say, or if I get it right. Yes, we do have a strong sense of identity, but of course, Belgium was not a natural country. The Isle of Man is the island. Mm-hmm. But Belgium was constructed in 1830 by the big countries, France and Germany and the UK. Mm-hmm. So it's not a natural how do you say? Homogeneous, country. It's not. So it's a constructed.
It has a short history, in effect, hasn't it?
It has, as such. But in saying that, like Flemish people, we go way back. And we have Celtic blood as well.
Well, they got everywhere, didn't they? Yes. Can I just take something, because I'm still curious about these voices and how they actually demonstrate themselves here. What you're saying is that you go somewhere and something points you to something and something else points you to something, and you're putting that down to an external influence and not to your own intellect or your own research.
Well, some people perhaps might call it intuition, and then my intuition would be extremely strong. So, of course, that I'm using also my academic skills, as you pointed out before, because you need both. It's not enough. But what I get is a very strong, even something in the stomach, a physical awareness that I have to be, that something is important. And I had it for places. Like I was looking for certain places where Charles had been, and then I was passing in a car, and all of a sudden I got this really strong physical feeling, and I said, I have to stop. And I turned back again, and then I found out, indeed, he had been there, and I could find, I had been found, I did find things in writing that were referring to that place.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't have recognized it unless I had had this very strong feeling in my body. So it tells me that he is voicing his concerns and his wishes, and he is also using his family. And through their voices, I can get a number of things as well. And I'm sure this is happening for Robert Boyd. I'm sure his family, through his family, he will tell me what I need to know, or what he wants me to know.
Looking at family history, looking at the history of various wars that have taken place over the years, and Britain's had its few in its day. What about the younger generation? Do you actually think these days that this type of thing, which is obviously of great importance to you, do you think the young people care very much about it all?
It all depends on how you present things. If it's boring, like at school and it's history, given in the old-fashioned way, they wouldn't. But if it was through stories like my stories, and explaining and making it vivid and explaining how things were and how things were looking like, that's what I tried in my book, you see. So people have told me, when I'm reading your book, it's like watching a movie. So what I want to do is just making them interested in a way that is theirs. And today, young people like the visual side of things, isn't it?
Well, I'm looking at your book. It's published by you. So it was published, and I presume on that basis, financed by you then, was it? That's it. So how many copies are in circulation? What was your first print
As
run?
many as I had soldiers. Can you believe that? I found out afterwards.
What, 1,000?
So, yes.
Yes. Okay. So 1,000 copies, and they're for sale, I assume. So what was the reaction to the book then when it appeared in New Zealand? Because it's a New Zealand market, I would gather. Did it sell?
It did.
Yeah.
It did. And all different kind of people, not only families, people who are interested in the war, because it's what I'm writing about is very representative for other people as well. So I'm writing about pilots. I'm writing about stretcher bearers, what they were doing. I'm trying to show all the different aspects to the war, but from a social point of view or a personal point of view, as human beings. People, soldiers are not just regimental numbers. They are the brothers, they are the sons, they are the fathers, and as such they have. So I put skin on their bones, as it were. That was a Maori man saying, that's what you have been doing, putting flesh on the bones of my uncle. And he was very grateful for me to have been doing it.
So we have an email in which says, full name of the book, please. It's signed by Rusty's dad. Well, the name of the book, I'll tell you what, I'll leave you to give them the name of the book. and also, there's an ISBN number, I presume, here somewhere, which would help them to get a copy over here. Yes, there is. The ISBN number, if you've got a pen, those of you listening at home, is 978-0-473-35267-3. I'll do that again slowly. 978-0-473-35267-3. That's the number you want to give to your bookshop if you're actually looking for it.
Yes, but perhaps it might be even easier to go through me, and I'm having an email address that perhaps could be put on the website, your website of the Manx Radio. And
might be able to, but do you want to give me that website now then? What is it?
Well, it's not a website, it's an email address on your website. So the email address is at the end of the book. it is La Basseville 1917. It's in one word, LABASSEVILLE 1917, no space in between,
Yes.
and at gmail.com.
Okay.
And then you would, even with questions, because I'm very willing to answer in whatever way I can help. I've got there's one soldier that was lost in La Basse-Ville, but I have more soldiers from the Isle of Man that were lost, who were with the New Zealand forces. I've got 9 of them.
Well, very good. Now, full name of the book, Rusty, it's La Basse-Ville, 1917, New Zealand Voices from Flanders Field. Fields, they're plurals of it. Right, that's now it. Now, we have a letter that's come in, which has absolutely nothing to do with what we're talking about, but this is the Mannin line, and it says, a lady in Port Heron has lost a green parrot called Poppet. So please check your sheds in the area and call her. The number's 836 309 if you see it. Right, that's it. Now, we've got about 6 minutes to go on the Mannin line today, and we have had very few, in fact, no phone calls at all. So let me remind you once more that the number is 66 13 68, and we would like to hear from you. 166177 of the texts, and the studio at manxradio.com for the emails. There's one thing that strikes me about all this, Dominic. You're talking about travelling around to New Zealand, and then you're going to Cairo, or you're going to whatever it was, to Egypt, and all these, and you're here. There's a huge amount of cost involved in this research.
Well, I was doing it on a string, as they say, on a shoestring. Yeah. No, I just tried to do it. It's all out of my pocket. It is. I think it's because of the passion. I'm all of this that I've done is with a labor of love. Mm-hmm. It's a labor of love because of the families, because of the men. I've got a very, very strong connection. You can call it a spiritual connection or whatever you call it, but it's a very strong connection to these men. So the image that's always coming up to me is just, it started with one, the first one, Charles, and I can see all these others sitting next to him and just, with the elbow saying to one another, go to her, she'll do it. And then the list is longer and longer. So I ended up with 1010 and perhaps more, because now I've been in the Isle of Man. I've got 9 men who were involved with the New Zealand forces. Only one died in the battle I am talking about in the book, but I have perhaps another one, I'm not sure. His name is Kenvig, and Kenvig is a Manx name, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And he was a 2nd lieutenant, and he was killed on the 31st of July. So at the peak, at the heat of the battle, and he might have been originally, or his family might have been from the Isle of Man, but he was born in Christchurch. Mm-hmm. So that's another one, but he is buried. He's got a proper tomb, and that is probably because he was a 2nd lieutenant. But so that's another way of linking myself from Flanders Fields, to the Isle of Man, because these men are still there in Belgium.
Now, let's just look to a little bit forward. You're here I asked you this before we started, is it about the month end, I gather, here in the Isle of Man?
About 3 weeks, yes. And I've just arrived.
Right. So, anybody listening today who might like to either obtain information from you, or more to the point, give you some, how do they make contact with you?
Well, they could email me at the email address we just mentioned earlier. Yes. I'm staying in Silver Creek here in Douglas. So that's a guest house. They could try and get in touch with me through them as well, perhaps. That's probably the way to do it, or perhaps via the radio here. I don't know.
Yes, well, if they come to the programme, Catherine would no doubt pass it on. But
yes, I'm sure.
Well, thank you very much. Well, we're not far now from we're 3 or 4 minutes from the end of our programme now. It's been very quiet for phone calls today, probably because we've got a rather complicated subject here for some people to grasp. But of course, this type of situation must exist over numerous countries, particularly from the First World War, because there were so many colonials brought into the conflict from all sorts of places. Have you met up with anybody else who's doing the same sort of research issue?
I think the way I've done it is very unique. I've never met anyone doing it in a similar way.
Mm-hmm.
Because my involvement was a real personal involvement, and everything I had, mentally, intellectually, physically, I gave my very, very best. And my grandchildren missed on my being around. So now it's 15 years since I started. So I've gone back to Belgium just recently, moved back to Belgium, and I'm going to try and enjoy my grandchildren. And there you are. I'm at the Isle of Man instead of enjoying my grandchildren while they are having summer holidays.
Did this project take over? Was that the reason why you ceased to be a judge, or was that just retirement time?
No, it was a choice.
Yes.
It was a choice because I thought this is so important. It just caught me, and it became my mission. And using that word mission, I think that runs in the family, because my uncle was a monk, my auntie was a missionary, and even a generation further, missionaries in China and everywhere as well. So it's like, we've been in my family, we are very community-minded. And my father was in Parliament for over 40 years. My mother was very involved in all sorts of things. So that's how I was brought up. It's part of who I am, giving something back, because these soldiers give their most precious thing, their life.
What do your children, I say your daughter and your grandchildren, make of all
No,
this?
I've got two sons, actually.
2 sons, is it?
2 sons and 4 grandchildren.
What do they make of it?
Well, my grandchildren are small. The oldest one is 7 and the youngest one is 2. And no, my children, I think, perhaps it's a bit mixed, but they do understand what I'm doing and why I am doing it. And they really support me, actually.
That's good. Well, there we are. We've just got a few seconds to go before the end of the programme, and our studio guest was Dominique Cooreman. Now, she's written a book which we talked about earlier on, La Basse-Ville 1917, which is about a hamlet, as she called it, which basically 1,000 New Zealand people were killed attacking it, and by the sound of it for no particularly good military reason. And also in the middle of that lot was a Manx chap, and she's doing a lot of other research over here now. So that is the end of that. Thank you for joining us, Dominique. Thank you for being our guest.
My pleasure, thank you.
William King was on the switch today, and I'm Roger Watterson, and we'll all be back again next week. Until then, goodbye.